Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Pascal Frank. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany. In collaboration with colleagues from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, the Free University of Berlin, and the University of Hamburg, I have recently elaborated a concept which we call personal approaches towards sustainability, which we conceive of as a new agenda for environmental and sustainability education. In this presentation, I will share with you some of the core ideas of this concept, outline why it constitutes an important advancement both for the scholarship and practice of ESE, and make some practical suggestions as to how personal approaches towards sustainability can be implemented in ESE practice. ESE, describing learning activities in which learners are supposed to acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, has been considered both by scholars and political actors as one of the most powerful tools to promote sustainable development. Throughout the last decades, it has been increasingly promoted in global international agendas in forms of education for sustainable development. For example, within the Rio 2012 conference, the Agenda 21, the UNESCO's Global Action Programme for Sustainable Development, or more recently within the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals. Among other reasons, this is because ESE is deemed to carry the potential to stimulate changes in what O'Brien has called the personal, in contrast to the practical and political sphere of transformation. It is this personal sphere, that is to say, people's inner worlds, including their intentions, mindsets, and paradigms, which, for example, Abson et al. Have described as the deepest leverage point for a sustainability transformation. Now, there seems to be a somewhat paradoxical trend concerning the relation between ESE on the one hand and sustainability-related problems on the other hand. More specifically, the literature shows that ESE learning activities have been globally introduced into basically all levels of education, that knowledge on sustainability-related problems has significantly increased throughout the last decades, and also the perceived importance of the vision of sustainability has increased among society, in particular in Western populations. At the same time, however, sustainability-related problems such as climate change, deforestation, or species extinction have even exacerbated throughout the last decades, and partly because individual behaviors have not really changed. Obviously, there are various reasons to explain this diametrical evolution, as for example, strong economic and political forces that oppose the vision of sustainability altogether. Yet what surprises is that even individuals who explicitly express sustainability-related values and their willingness to act upon these overall do not act differently in comparison to others. For this reason, it has been argued that current ESE scholarship and practice has not yet contributed to mitigating the sustainability-related problems it is meant to remedy. Obviously, there are many reasons why this might be the case. As part of an explanation, some sustainability scholars have recently criticized that current ESE scholarship and practice almost exclusively problematizes sustainability-related problems in terms of threats to nature, ecosystems, and societies, and reflects causes and solutions for these problems in terms of social economic structures, technological innovations, or governance dynamics. In addition, the envisaged learning outcomes of current ESE practices are characterized by a strong focus on cognitive intellectual competencies, such as analyzing, evaluating, or assessing, which has also been criticized. What current ESE scholarship and practice widely neglects, in contrast, are inner or personal dimensions of sustainability. That is to say, learners' own bodily sensations, emotions, needs, sensory sensations, values, and the like. Analogously, learners' subjective well-being and their inner literacy, meaning their ability to deal with their inner states and processes, remain widely ignored as learning outcomes of ESE. In sum, in current ESE scholarship and practice, the learner is commonly detached from sustainability-related problems, and the focus on cognitive intellectual competencies somewhat suggests that their solution is only a matter of right thinking. Yet I'm sure all of you experienced on your own that we are much more deeply related to sustainability-related problems. Obviously, it impacts our inner worlds to be confronted with the threats of current unsustainability, and so do our inner worlds contribute to unsustainability. Recent sustainability scholarship has pointed to this reciprocity. For example, in terms of climate anxiety, the role of emotions and psychological coping mechanisms for explaining unsustainable behavior, and as a consequence, the importance of self-care and personal well-being in the face of the social and environmental threats surrounding us. Yet despite such evidence, the personal dimensions remain largely ignored in ESE. And even though some scattered suggestions have been made as to how to address them, there has not yet been a systematic way to address the personal dimension in education. And this is where the personal approaches towards sustainability come into play. Now, the idea behind the personal approaches is to conceptualize and elaborate how individuals' subjective experience in relation to sustainability can be systematically addressed in ESE scholarship and practice. As mentioned in the beginning, I have initiated a working group in September last year on this topic. And what I'm going to present on the following slides is the current state of the art of this working process. So in the first step, we define personal approaches toward ESE as learning activities enabling learners to experience their conditions, possibilities, resources, challenges, and limitations for engaging with the cause of sustainability. The subjective experience and reflection of inner states and processes, that is to say, their bodily and sensory sensations, emotions, motivations, beliefs, and worldviews, lies at the center of these learning activities. The overall goal of personal approaches is to build learners' inner literacy, meaning that learners should expand their options of dealing with inner states and processes. Inner literacy, in turn, is supposed to help learners facing and overcoming individual challenges of engaging with the cause of sustainability. In other words, the rationale is that through explicitly addressing individual subjective experience in relation to sustainability, it is possible to develop an inner literacy and therefore initiate some kind of inner transformation towards sustainability, which will result eventually in an increased ability and willingness to engage with the vision of sustainability altogether. For this reason, we think that personal approaches toward ESE might be the missing piece that helps ESE unfolding its transformative potential. In a second step, we identified the kinds of relation individuals have with sustainability. We identified 4 relations and called them dimensions of personal approaches. As you can see on this slide, we distinguish the dimension of experiencing unsustainability, inner manifestations of unsustainability, inner sustainability, and the individual as change agent for sustainability. So let me explain these dimensions in some more detail. Experiencing unsustainability explores what happens to learners when they are confronted with unsustainability. For example, what effective motivational reactions are prompted by the confrontation with social or environmental threats, for example, climate change. How do they cope with these threats? Similarly, it is also possible to explore how they experience sustainability, for example, when staying in an eco-village or so. The aim of such an exploration would be to enable learners to deal with the effective motivational challenges in a constructive, problem-oriented way instead of engaging with coping strategies. In the second dimension, learners inquire into personal manifestations of unsustainability. For example, they might explore inner states and processes leading them to repeatedly engage in unsustainable consumption, or analogously, what helps them consuming in a sustainable way. Either way, the focus lies on the exploration of those inner states and processes that make learners act sustainably or unsustainably, therefore helping them identifying their inner causes of unsustainable and supporting factors for sustainable behavior. The inner sustainability dimension, third, is based on the idea that there is in fact an inner manifestation of the vision of sustainability. Exploring inner sustainability means to focus on what learners need for their personal and need satisfaction and mental as well as physical well-being. A profane example would be to teach learners what they can do against back pain as a cause of too much sitting. So after all, health is a very relevant aspect of sustainability, and education for inner sustainability should include teaching people how to stay healthy. The individual as change maker towards sustainability finally describes the dimension in which learners explore their inner experiences in their professional role as change agents. For example, what is it like to become politically active for sustainability transformation? What is it like to establish sustainable practices in business? And of course, what kind of inner literacy is needed to properly fulfill one's role as change agent? So these are basically the 4 dimensions of personal approaches that can be separately addressed in educational practices, even though obviously they are sort of intertwined. Yeah? So obviously an important question that follows is how personal approaches can be put into ESE practice. Before I will illustrate a specific example, I want to point out 5 general principles that I think are characteristic for this kind of education. First and foremost, personal approaches toward ESE is relation-centered. That is to say that the relation with the learners and educator comes first. The reason for this is quite simple. In order to share and reflect subjective experience, learners need to feel comfortable sharing the experience, and this is only possible based on a good relation. Second, personal approaches are self-experiential. That is to say that the learning activity actively encourages learners to explore their inner worlds. Third, this exploration is holistic, meaning that it offers learners the opportunity to explore subjective experience in its entirety, including its bodily, sensory, cognitive, and affective motivational dimension. Fourth, personal approaches are supportive, and this characteristic is based on research indicating that people do not have automatic access to inner states and processes. And therefore, it is necessary to provide learners some sort of introspective training, for example, in forms of mindfulness meditation practice that helps them cultivating and, in fact, tolerating these inner states and processes. Fifth, and finally, personal approaches are not limited to a specific disciplinary background, but can be integrated in any sort of disciplinary teaching. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation earlier in this presentation, there have been some suggestions as to how to put personal approaches into practice, which you can find below on this slide. Here, I want to focus on a pedagogy which we have developed and experimented with at Leuphana University, which is called self-inquiry-based learning. Briefly speaking, the pedagogy foresees that learners engage in a specific activity throughout a certain period of time, document their subjective experience with this activity, and finally use scientific methods to develop an intersubjective understanding of their subjective experiences. The process is accompanied by introspective training, as indicated before. So in our seminar in which we applied this pedagogy, learners would choose a transformational project of their consumer behavior, which they would pursue over the course of the seminar. If you're interested in the more scientific inquiry into the seminar, you might want to check out one of the sources indicated below in bold. What I want to emphasize here is how participants would actually speak about the experience of participating in the seminar. I've been offering similar courses since 2016, and almost univocally, students would describe the participation in these learning activities as a really unique experience of their studies that were in fact valuable well beyond their disciplinary training, which sort of indicates that this kind of personal approaches really achieves what it aims to achieve, namely to access this personal inner world of learners. Obviously, personal approaches are, however, still in their infancy, and a lot of work needs to be done in order to solidify and establish them in the field of ESE. There needs to be, for example, more research on and experimentation with learning activities, as empirical evidence in this field is very scarce for now. Furthermore, whether and how corresponding learning outcomes can be defined and assessed is something that is still controversially discussed in the field. And A final problem I want to point out is that educators might in fact need competencies that go beyond their disciplinary expertise for teaching or facilitating personal approaches. So inquiring into these questions might in fact open up, if not require, new inter and transdisciplinary collaborations, potentially bridging ESE scholarship and practice with so far separated fields such as psychology or psychotherapy, sports and movement science, or contemplative sciences, among others. So I will end my presentation at this point. Here you can find the literature I have referenced on my slides. And if you have any questions, comments, or critique, or if you're interested in collaborating on this field, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me.